Hello everyone and welcome to today's Times Journeys webinar, The History, Culture and Contemporary Life of Cuba. My name is Victoria Hanson and I'm the Programme Manager here at the New York Times for Times Journeys. During the next 40 minutes you'll hear about this incredible country as I walk you through the itinerary of the 11-day tour that includes an 8-night cruise on board Le Ponant, a yacht chartered exclusively for the New York Times, and introduce you to today's special guest, Anthony DePalma, the former New York Times journalist and one of the experts who joined the trip. But before we start, why travel with the New York Times? Well, first and foremost, on each of our 125 plus departures, you will be accompanied by either a New York Times journalist or a subject matter expert. From editorial board members and our foreign correspondents who have reported from the ground, to historians, opera aficionados and authors, they will share their insights and knowledge with each of our travellers. In addition, we visit destinations that tell a story, destinations as diverse as Cuba, Provence, Myanmar, and themes that expand from politics to history to food and wine. In addition, on each of our trips you'll receive exclusive access, whether that's meetings with locals or tours behind the scenes at museums before they've opened. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Anthony DePalma, who's going to be joining this trip and is going to just share a few words about his experience in Cuba to date. Anthony.
Okay, thank you, Tori, and bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to all of you who are thinking about or have already signed up for this amazing trip. Tori mentioned that these voyages tell a story, and I can almost guarantee you that the story that this voyage will tell is one unlike any other that you've ever heard before. In fact, for me, this is a unique experience. Although I've been traveling to Cuba for both work and personal reasons, for family, since 1979, I've never actually seen Cuba from this perspective. We tend to think of Cuba as an island in the Caribbean, the largest island in the Caribbean, but in fact, it is an archipelago of thousands of islands and small keys. The main island itself is roughly 650 miles from end to end, but because of the way it's set up and all of the crags and bays, there are 3,500 miles of coastline. And on board this ship, you'll have the opportunity to see a large percentage of that, both incredibly important ecological sites because of the biodiversity of Cuba, which has more plants and animal species than anywhere else in the Caribbean, and also for historic reasons as we go by and stop at the Bay of Pigs. For Americans, it might be a little bit uncomfortable to see exactly the role that the United States played in this, but it is an absolutely central fact in the history of the Cold War and in the history of the hemisphere. I'm looking forward to it because there will be things that, even though I've been to Cuba so many times, that I've never seen, and looking forward to sharing them with you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. We'll be giving him a formal introduction later on when we discuss his role on board and why it's such a special aspect of Times Journeys to have the journalists there to give their inside knowledge and experience. But just very quickly, here's a brief overview of the trip itself. It's both a cruise and a land stay. So in total, it's going to be an 11-day, 10-night trip. 8 nights on board Le Ponant, a beautiful sailing yacht that we've chartered exclusively for the New York Times for this trip. So day 1 to 9, you'll be on board the ship there. Starting off in Havana, everybody arrives together on the same charter flight from Miami. You'll start off in Havana, as I say, you'll board the ship, and then we'll sail around. Day 2 is at sea as we explore the Cape San Antonio, and then you'll be going to the Isla de la Juventud, the Carolago, the Bay of Pigs, which everybody has heard of, and we'll speak a little bit more about that. Spending a couple of days in Trinidad before disembarking in Santiago, where we then start our land portion of the trip with a 2-night stay in Havana. Now, on board, you're going to be receiving all of your meals. You're obviously going to have a tour manager, local guides, and all of your accommodation, of course, is included too. Now, just a little bit about Le Ponant. She is owned by Ponant, originally designed as a private motor yacht, and is because of that a very exclusive ship indeed. She holds 64 passengers, of which we'll actually only take up to 58 times journeys guests with us. The rest of the space will be dedicated to the likes of Anthony, the other New York Times expert who's New York Times journalist or expert that will be having join us on the ship, and your tour managers as well. On board, you have 2 lounges, a number of sun decks, and 2 restaurants as well. There are a number of different types of staterooms. I would say, unfortunately, the Antigua stateroom is now sold out. It's waitlist only. So if you are interested in that particular room, I would get in touch immediately, put your name down, but in the meantime, perhaps book a different level. But on board, we have a variety of different amenities. So from flat screen satellite television, Wi-Fi is available for an additional fee, I believe. Both 110 and 220 volt outlets, all of the essential modern day facilities that you'd expect. Now, the itinerary itself is going to be visiting a number of key historic sites, from the Parque Nacional Marino de Punta Pedernales, which is the marine conservation area, as I said, mentioned earlier, the Bay of Pigs, visiting the Gran Parque Natural Montemar, which is the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and also a walking tour of Trinidad itself as well. Some of the trip highlights beyond the historic piece, obviously sailing on the ship exclusively for the New York Times Group is going to be one of the big ones. And I think for a lot of people, the post-cruise stay in Havana is going to be the other one as well. In fact, before we even announced that was the one question that we were getting asked all the time for the call centre is, am I going to get to spend any time in Havana? And yes, you are. Now, without our tour operators, there really would be no trip. And so at this point, I'd like to hand over to Kate Murphy, who works at Judy Pearl Worldwide Travel, who are the tour operators running this trip. Kate's on the line today if anybody has any questions later on specific to the logistics of the trip, how to book, things like that. She's worked in the travel industry for a number of years with exclusive cruise lines like Regent Seven Seas and Oceania. She's been working for Judy Pearl Worldwide since 2001. And so, Kate, it's fantastic to have you on the line today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tori. I'm very excited to be here. And we at Judy Pearl Worldwide Travel are thrilled to be working with the Times Journeys on this exclusive chartered sailing in Cuba in March 2017. We operate tours all over the globe, as you know, and work tirelessly to match our clients with their desired trip ambiance, services, and excursions to provide a very unique experience. And just a bit more about our company, we have over 100 years of combined travel experience, and our close-knit team shares enthusiasm with all of our clients for the travel services we provide. And as the tour operator for this trip, we hope to welcome everyone aboard.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yes, we hope to welcome 58 of you on board next year. And so with that, I'm now going to formally introduce Anthony. Anthony DePalma spent 22 years as a reporter and foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and he was the first Americas correspondent covering the North, Central and South America. His interest in Cuba, as you mentioned, is both professional and personal. He's married to Miriam Rodriguez, who was born in Cuba and left to come over to the United States in 1959 following the revolution. He's perhaps one of his biggest claims to fame is the fact that he wrote The Man Who Invented Fidel, a book that you can see on the screen there. And when he left the New York Times, he went to become a writer in residence at Seton Hall University. His bio is very, very impressive indeed. And so let me at this point hand you over again to Anthony, who can talk a little bit more about his background and why you're also lucky to have him joining this trip.
Thank you. Thank you. As I indicated before, Cuba is a special place. Of all the places that I've worked in and written about, there's very few others, if any at all, that have been as complex and at the same time have struck right at the heart as Cuba. There's something about it that sets it apart from every other place. In large measure, I think it's because for all of us who are here today, it has been for a small island of now only 11 million people. Back before the revolution, it was only 6 million. It has been at the center of so much of history and our contemporary history, both for good and for things that have caused lots of consternation for so long. It is like Cuba. I always think of Cuba as a lightweight boxer boxing well above its weight. It carries an importance that goes far beyond what would be expected of a Caribbean island, even if it is the largest island in the Caribbean. And all of that is because of its proximity to the United States. Now, 90 miles, right, is often the figure that's used. It's actually 90 miles from Key West, and it is just 90 miles. From Miami, when you fly down, it'll be slightly longer than that. It's about 300 miles, but it really is just a 45-minute flight. By the time the jet reaches flying altitude, you begin the descent. But I can guarantee you that despite the brevity of that trip, you will be traveling from one world into quite another one. Almost right from the moment that you land in Havana at Jose Marti Airport, you will begin to see how different it is. And so that becomes an aspect of the trip that will stay with you the whole time. It's so close, and yet it has been for so many years so distant from us. It's only in the last few years that these kinds of trips have been possible. Now, as a journalist and also someone with family in Cuba, I've been able to travel back and forth, but most Americans have not been able to do so. And even today, there are restrictions. So any trip that is conducted is special. Last year, there were about 175,000 Americans who made the voyage to Cuba on charter flights. Most of them stayed in Havana. Very few of them were able to travel outside of Havana on any of the tours. And I don't know that there are any Americans who've been able to take a trip like this. What you'll find is a combination of history and culture, of a society that is very much steeped in the past, as you see that 58 Pontiac, or the last time I was there, I got to ride in a 1959 Edsel convertible, very sharp. It was some kind of inferno red, and they had the top down, and we drove along the Malecón, and it was a memorable experience for sure. And yet, despite the fact that all that history is there, it is very much a culture in transition. And you're going to be arriving at a moment of transition. This trip is scheduled for a year from now, a little bit less than a year from now. We really don't even know what it's going to be like at that time because things continue to change so very quickly. And that makes it even more exciting to be there. What I particularly like about these trips is the people-to-people aspect to it. And for New York Times readers, the way many of the people on these trips are, that combination of being able to see things new and also learning about them and having the opportunity to deal with people on a face-to-face, individual-to-individual basis makes it so much more than a vacation. It is a learning experience. It is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and people really feel that. My job during this time is to sort of be a leveler because Cuba is quite complex. Even after all these decades of being down there, it's still difficult for me to understand exactly what's going on. As it is for any analyst or any expert. For people who are there the first time, there will be lots of apparent contradictions. And so I try to fill in the gaps, give you a little bit of the history, give you some of the nuances that may not be quite apparent. But once you see them, then you begin to understand things with a different level of understanding and complexity that makes the experience even richer.
Thank you. And actually, to Anthony's point there, one of the things that everybody will get to enjoy on board are a number of different lectures. So Anthony's going to be talking about a number of different topics. Again, I'll hand it back over to you here to give a little bit of a taster. But this is really the only way that we can sort of try and clearly show you what it really means to travel with the New York Times.
Mm-hmm. So we will actually be passing the spot where in late 1956, Fidel and Raul Castro, along with an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, and about 80 other revolutionaries, tried to land in an old leaky yacht. Guarantee you that it doesn't look anything like the Ponant. This was an old fishing boat that Fidel bought in Mexico from an American, and Grandma was actually the name of the boat. You have to keep that in mind because that becomes a recurring theme in our stay in Cuba. Cubans are very big on history and very proud of their history. So Granma is actually the name of the boat. When you're in Havana, you'll actually see it. It is there under glass in a very central part of Havana. Guarantee that you'll have a chance to see it. And the province where he landed is now called Granma. But it was pretty much a disaster. Most of the people were killed. In fact, the New York Times ran a story on the front page saying that all of them were killed, including Fidel Castro. That was the first time he was declared dead in the New York Times. So from that kind of a start, how did he end up just a few years later taking control of everything? And it's a pretty amazing story even till today. And in fact, the New York Times had a role in it. And that's part of what I'll be talking about in that first lecture, An Unlikely Revolution. Then I think it's important to understand what the revolution has actually meant. And in order to do that, you need to see what Cuba was like before the revolution and what has happened since then. So there have been many successes. You may have heard about their education and healthcare system and the way they've increased equality among men and women and among minorities and non-minorities. But there also have been setbacks in terms of human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and other things. And we'll try to take a very neutral but fact-based accounting of both. The third theme is an important one, I think, for Americans to understand how this long standoff, and we're talking about more than half a century between the United States and Cuba, has had ramifications for the entire hemisphere. Cuba's ability to negotiate and to do business with other countries, even though they're not impacted directly by our embargo, has meant that its economy and the way it has done business with the rest of the world has been shaped in a way that's not natural. The embargo, by the way, also has had an impact on Cuba's biodiversity and its environmental status. And so we'll talk a lot about how that has happened. But the United States also has had a price to pay where other countries in the hemisphere have increasingly aligned themselves with Cuba against the United States. And so the opening by the Obama administration has helped actually improve U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America. So we'll talk about that in some detail to understand how Cuba, this small island, fits in the context of the entire hemisphere. And then finally, we'll end up with the changes that are going on now in this transition and the challenges they represent for both sides, not just the United States opening up and reopening its embassy and reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba, but for the Cuban government, which is trying to manage a very, very delicate transition from pure communist or socialist economic and political system to some sort of a hybrid that they haven't yet completely worked out. You will be there just as this transition is taking place. So there'll be lots to talk about, and of course I will be with you for the trip and available for questions throughout.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, this is very much both a country in transition and a tour in transition as well, being the first charter for the Times. And as Anthony said at the beginning, who knows what we'll be talking about in March of 2017. Something else may well have come to light. In fact, I'm sure it will. I'm sure a number of things will have done. And so maybe the topics discussed will reflect those as well. So let's just start going through the itinerary itself. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, we're going to be flying from Miami to Havana and boarding Le Ponant, the 290-foot sailing yacht there that you can see on the screen. You'll have a briefing later that day and also a reception on board to welcome everybody and to give you a clear idea of what it is that you can expect over the following 11 days. The following day, as I mentioned earlier, is at sea. So this is the opportunity where you'll get to relax on board. We'll sail around the north coast, around Cape San Antonio. And this is a perfect day to really listen to a number of the different lectures whilst you're at sea to get that background knowledge of both the current and historic past of Cuba itself and start discussing the US-Cuban relations. The following day, we'll visit Isla de la Juventud, the island of youth, which is the largest island off Cuba's coast. And the highlight for today is a tour of the marine conservation area, Parque Nacional Marino de Punta Pedernales, which was established in 1978. And here you'll get to meet with Cubans involved with preserving the fragile ecosystem of the island. So your first chance to start meeting and discussing with them. The following day, we visit Key Largo, where again you'll get the opportunity to meet with local management to learn about tourism's role in the Cuban economy and with scientists involved in coral reef protection too. You will also visit the homes of locals as well and discuss conservation with fishermen. So this really is a very important day to meet with a number of different people on the ground to get a different perspective for those various different livelihoods there. And day 5, I think, is really, for everybody in the US, the place that you probably know the most. So Bahia de Cochinos, in English, the Bay of Pigs, the site where in 1961, 1,300 armed Cuban exiles backed by the United States were thwarted in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, and it was a turning point that led to Cuba's looking more towards the Soviet Union. So you'll visit the landing beach at Playa Girón and its museum. You'll learn about the event from a Cuban perspective as well. And also that day you'll have lunch in a local paladar and meet with students and teachers at a local art school.
Paladar is actually a restaurant. The origin of it was a few years ago. The Castro government started to allow individual Cubans to have a kind of their own business. Remember, the economy is socialist, so everything was owned and operated by the state. Mm-hmm. Paladars were originally supposed to be small restaurants in a home with a limited number of tables, 12, no employees. It had to be just the owner and the family. So that's the way it started, paladares. Paladar is a word that comes from, believe it or not, a Brazilian soap opera. Cubans are like that. They'll pick up a phrase and they'll use it over and over again in a strange way. Don't be surprised to hear them refer to Yuma. And you'll at first say, Yuma, Arizona? What? Why Well, Yuma is a word now that refers actually to the United States. Because 30 Seconds to Yuma was a very popular 1950s Western that was remade a couple of years ago, and it would show up on TV. And so Yuma became their catchphrase for everything up there, because they oftentimes think of Americans as kind of cowboys. Bay of Pigs probably helped that image. But the paladares today have become sophisticated, and depending on what this one is like, you'll get a chance to taste some real authentic Cuban food. One of the things I want to mention is this is going along the southern coast of Cuba, and between the Isla de Juventud, which used to be called the Isle of Pines, now it's the Isle of Youth, and the Bay of Pigs, there's a huge natural area called the Swamp of Zapata, which would mean that there aren't going to be many lights. So at night, from the ship, the sky ought to be absolutely amazing. Mm. And that's something that you're not going to be able to see in Havana, where there are lots of lights, or any other place. So I'm actually looking forward to that. Maybe we'll see some shooting stars and who knows what else.
Wow, that'd be incredible. Yeah, light pollution is another topic that's being talked about a lot at the moment. So that in itself would be a very nice opportunity to see shooting stars. Who knows? The following day, we're going to be visiting Trinidad, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and really it's the crown jewel of Cuba's colonial towns. It was founded in 1514 and it was the centre of Cuba's sugar and slave trades in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here you'll get the opportunity to take a walking tour led by representatives of the Office of the City Historian. Again, talk with residents along the way. And highlights include the Plaza Mayor and the Museo Romantico, which is a former count's home. Later, you'll have the opportunity to meet with the owner of a Cuban B&B. Again, another local business initiative, similar, I'm assuming, to the Paladars. But the Cuban B&Bs, the term there is a casa particular, and you'll learn about this relatively new form of independent business there. The following day, we return to Trinidad, and this time it's to explore religion and the different religions of the area. So Santeria is an Afro-Cuban religion which originated in West Africa, and it combines facets of Christianity and secret rituals, which is openly practiced in Cuba. After exploring that, you'll return to the ship for lunch and will then set sail for Santiago, which again is another opportunity to hear more from the journalists on board the ship, to relax if you'd prefer, or just to mingle amongst the other guests on board. So the following day will begin at sea as we're continuing our journey to Santiago itself. We arrive late in the afternoon, and this unfortunately is going to be your farewell meal for the cruise, the trip very quickly coming to an end, or this part of the trip I should say, but it's again in a local restaurant, so an authentic experience, something very different to your traditional restaurants in any of the other big cities in the US. So day 9 is the start of your next adventure. It's like part 2 of your vacation. And we always say with trips to Cuba, really the best thing you can do is come with a sense of adventure and flexibility. We plan things out as best we can. Invariably, things change. So day 9, we're going to be flying back from Santiago to Havana. We'll let you know the times of the flights much closer to departure. But upon your arrival into Havana itself, you're going to get the opportunity to visit the memorial to the Cuban poet and essayist Jose Marti and the Museum of Fine Arts. And in the evening, you'll be attending a private cocktail party at a private collector's home. The following day, we're going to be visiting, again, I think it's one of the highlights for a lot of people. It's Ernest Hemingway's home, Finca Vigia. Is that how you pronounce it?
Vigía.
Vigía. Thank you very much, sir. Amongst a number of other things, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, Ernest Hemingway wrote all or part of For Whom the Bell Tolls There, The Old Man and the Sea, and A Movable Feast. Later on, we'll be exploring some of Havana's other neighbourhoods in Miramar and Cubancan and the School of Superior Art. And you'll also meet the artist, we'll go and visit the studio of artist Jose Fuster. Whilst we're in Havana, I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to mention it again, you're going to be staying at the Parque Central, and later that evening, again, you'll get the opportunity for another cocktail party and a visit to another artist's home. The following day is the end of the tour, unfortunately. You'll be flying back from Havana to Miami. I'm sure it's going to be a trip that goes ever so quickly, but I hope that leaves you with some fantastic memories as well. I don't know if you want to end.
Well, one of the things I always like to keep in mind when I'm traveling is a quote from John Steinbeck, one of my favorite authors. And Steinbeck, who traveled quite a bit with his dog, travels with Charlie, and also outside of that, he was a war correspondent and a journalist and a novelist. But he said, we don't take a trip. A trip takes us. And that can apply to just about any travel, but in particular, it really does apply to a place like Cuba and a trip like this, because it is so unique. The other thing I do like to remind people is to be flexible, because Cuba is very much a country in transition. And so Miriam and I, as we've traveled back and forth so many times over the years, have come up with our own watchword for it, and that is Cuba siempre una aventura, Cuba always an adventure. Of course, it is in a positive sense, and sometimes things don't actually work on schedule. But if you are flexible enough and you understand that this is a country under tremendous pressure to change, people trying to do the best that they can, things not always the same standard as we would have in the United States, but always done with a great deal of care and usually compassion and a feeling of friendship You won't find people on the street yelling at you because you're Americans. More likely, they will come up to you and say, Obama, yes, especially after the trip. Although by next March,
Yeah.
it will be a transition not only in our country, but 2017 will be Raul Castro's last year in office. So they'll be ready for a change as well. They'll just have to wait and see what that's all like. But remember, flexibility helps everything go a lot more smoothly.
Yeah, I think that's a very important note to mention there. The next couple of slides, again, are just recapping some of the elements that I spoke about there. And actually, just before we came online, Anthony was talking about some of his experiences with American convertible cars, and so you'll actually get the opportunity to do that as well. Now, this is the point what we always like to give our listeners the opportunity to ask questions. So we've covered off some frequently asked questions here because they get asked time and time again. But if you have any specific questions, there is a panel on the right hand side of the screen that you should be able to see there, and that you can fill those in. So start thinking about those, writing those. We've got a few minutes before we wrap things up here, so I'm going to just cover these off very quickly. So is international airfare included? The price does include your flight from Miami to Havana, from Santiago to Havana, and Havana back to Miami. However, it doesn't include getting to Miami in the first place. And quite frankly, we find that a lot of people want to use their air miles generally, so this gives you the flexibility to do that. What documentation is needed for travel to Cuba? Well, as we mentioned, this is a very special trip, so you'll be needing both a visa and a signed certificate of travel. But Judy Pearl Caton and Judy herself will be able to help you with the logistics of that. And so once you sign up, they'll be sharing the process and the documentation with you. Are there lectures and activities on board? Yes, there are. You had a taste of the lectures that Anthony will be delivering. They may, of course, change come March, depending on what's going on in the world. But that just gives you a taster of those. And there'll also be another journalist or expert with you as well. So those will be spread out throughout the time on the ship. What are the travel regulations for Cuba? Well, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard, the regulations are quite strict, and you need to follow the rules. And so one of the things that we have to make sure everybody understands is that we have a set itinerary, and it's necessary that everybody follows that in order for us to fulfill the requirements of our people-to-people license, which enables us to offer these types of trips. Will I be able to use the internet or my phone? Yes, you will. Internet and phone services available to purchase on board. However, we can't guarantee the quality or the availability of it in the different locations. When you're in Havana, you'll be able to purchase a Wi-Fi card at the hotel. And a question that's obviously coming up because of the recent talk about Zika. Quite frankly, I think everybody should just be talking to their medical professional. But as with other mosquito-borne illnesses, just make sure that you take appropriate clothing with you, insect repellent, and if you do have any other questions, as I say, talk to your medical professional, or you could visit cdc.gov/Zika. So at this point, I'm just going to take a look and see if we've had any questions submitted. So the first one is, what is the capacity of the ship? So as I mentioned, it's 64 passengers, of which 58 will be guests of the New York Times. The other 6 will be the likes of Anthony, the other journalists, the tour operator. Layouts were on the slideshow earlier. However, you can see more about the staterooms themselves by visiting the Times Journeys website. So if you type in timesjourneys.com, it will come up, or you can take a look at the Ponant website as well. So Ponant is the cruise line who we've chartered the ship from. So now we've got a question, and it's actually something that we spoke about offline around the type of cash. So I'm just going to hand that over to Anthony to answer that one.
Okay, so American dollars will not work down there. You'll need to change from either American dollars or euros or Canadian dollars. Those are the three currencies that I have successfully been able to exchange down there. I tried once with Mexican pesos, but they wouldn't take them. So American dollars, euros, or Canadian dollars can all be changed. They have regular exchange houses at the airport in Havana. The exchange rate tends to be about 86 or 87 cents, or you get back 87 cents for your dollar. They charge about $1.20 for each Cuban peso. Now, just take a second, and not to confuse everyone, but this will come up. There are two currencies in Cuba. There's a Cuban peso, which is used by the Cuban people to buy supplies in state-run stores. You will probably not ever even see them. The other is called, believe it or not, the CUC, CUC, but they converted to CUC. And that is the convertible Cuban peso. That's an artificial invention of the Cuban government. Long history, we can talk about that on board if you like, but the Cuban government charges a 10% penalty for every US dollar converted to CUCs. Those are the tourist dollars. By next March, that could be changed, and that tariff could be lifted. That's part of the negotiation, and it has been agreed to, but there are certain conditions that need to be met that haven't yet been met. So my last trip there 3 weeks ago, they were still charging that 10%. So you can change from, if you think it is advisable, or you prefer to do it that way, you can change your US dollars to euros and then find out what that exchange rate is, because there won't be the penalty, that 10% penalty on either Canadian dollars or euros, and you can change them down there. There may be some exchange houses in Trinidad, but I'm not sure what kind of rate you would get there, and there are banks in Havana, but when you arrive, you won't have an opportunity to do that. You will have an opportunity on the way back. But you're going to be on board most of the time, so there really, outside of Trinidad, there really isn't any place where you're going to need money until you get back to Havana. And then you can, at the Parque Central, they actually have a bank right in the lobby of the hotel, and the reception desk will also change your dollars, Canadian dollars, or euros. So it's very easy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that one. So we've been asked another question around, can we arrive in Havana a few days early? And I think that sounds very simple and very straightforward. However, because we go back to everything in Cuba being an adventure, and the fact that we currently do only have charter flights, our recommendation would certainly be to take the group charter flight that we're going to be arranging, not only because that way you're staying as part of the itinerary, but also you know then that you've got the support of the tour operators with you. Some of the other questions that we get asked are around activity level, and as I mentioned, we're going to be doing a few different walking tours on this trip. So we always recommend that you can walk unaided over uneven ground for sort of 3 to 4 miles or so. And of course, as you're walking around the yacht as well, that can pitch around depending on the sea state. So again, we do need you to be able to be relatively stable, or to have decent walking shoes as well, I should say, in addition to having decent walking shoes as you're walking around. We will provide everybody with a packing list before you travel. So if anybody has any questions around what to pack, what to bring with you, that will give you a few pointers, and I think is also very handy as well, especially when you start thinking about experiences on board the ship too, the different dress codes that maybe come up, and I think that will help keep everybody all the packing together.
Just a word about the climate in Cuba. I've never been any place where the climate has been so agreeable. The average standard temperature is 77 degrees
Very
all
nice.
year long. Now it'll be cooler on the water, and it'll be warmer on land, but generally it is ideal or close to it.
Oh, perfect. So I think that is all of the questions that we've been asked. If anybody does have any questions, then by all means, feel free to contact our call centre, which is 855-698-7979. But I'm just going to run through a quick recap of the trip itself and also to talk about prices. So the trip leaves March 17th, 2017. It runs through to March the 27th. It's limited, as I say, to 58 passengers because we need to make sure that Anthony's got a cabin on the ship. The 11-day trip is $10,000. The starting price is $10,975, and that would be for a Marie Gallant stateroom. For a premium cabin, it's $11,290. As I mentioned, we do have Antigua staterooms. They've currently all sold out, so it is waitlist only. If anybody wants to sign up, I would recommend calling as soon as you can so that you don't miss out on this opportunity. It is the only ship that we have chartered going through to Cuba on the schedule at the moment, a very special trip indeed. And of course, if you have any questions about the tour, then Kate and the Judy Pearl team will be able to answer questions for you there. To book, it's $1,000 deposit per person, and if you're travelling on your own, the single supplement is it's a 200% of the price. You can find additional information on the Times Journeys website. It's a very long URL, so I'm not expecting you to remember it, but it is at the bottom of the screen here. And we will be, as you probably have seen, we're recording this webinar and we will be posting it onto the website in a couple of days as well. So then you'll be able to go back to read through the itinerary at your own pace, to listen again to Anthony talk about his experiences there, and the different lectures that you can expect on board the ship. Now, if Cuba has whetted your appetite, we have a couple of other trips in our Cuba program, and some of the tours and travel to Cuba that Anthony was mentioning earlier was actually part of our land program that he's joined. How many of those have you joined now? 4 of those. So he really is very well travelled and has joined a number of those Times Journeys departures, so he knows the New York Times travellers very well and can really help add value there. So we have the land programme with departures from November this year all the way through to December next year, and then we have one that focuses on women and women's rights in Cuba. There's one in November this year, one in May next year. Again, all of these details can be found on the website. So with that, Kate, do you have any closing remarks? It was very quiet for you today, so I'm hoping that means that people have had all of their questions answered and they'll just ring and book.
Yes, exactly. Victoria, you and Anthony did a fantastic job, so thank you for making it very simple for us here today.
Thank you. Anthony, any closing remarks?
If this is an exciting time, next year I think will be even more exciting. to visit Cuba, because the changes will be continuing, and there's so much more to come that we don't know. In particular, this trip, which is the only departure you have, there isn't going to be a whole bunch of them. It's just this one, is really so unique that I think it will stand apart. When travelers are on this trip and they get back, I can just imagine what it's going to be like, because all of the other travelers who take the other tours tell me afterwards that they are so filled up with stories and impressions and emotions that came up during the trip that they can't wait to tell people. That maybe times 100 would be this trip. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. We're so pleased to have you joining us on this trip, and as Anthony said, it is the only Cuba cruise that we're offering. So if this is something that's either on your bucket list or one of those experiences that you feel that you need to join and to experience for yourself, then we'd love to have you. And as I said, if you do have any questions, or in order to book before those other staterooms sell out, please do ring us on 855-698-7979. And we look forward to seeing you in Havana and in Cuba in March of 2017. Thank you very much, everyone.